Okay, I'm back for what I guess will be part 3, talking about the brain network reinforcements. We had 3 for the big 3: default mode, cognitive control, and the limbic network. Let's talk about cognitive control and then limbic. The cognitive control is like the CEO. Whenever you go into task mode, the cognitive control kicks into gear, and it's very good at managing and also delegating. So the cognitive control network is when you go into task mode, especially when there's cognition involved, meaning thinking, determination, deliberation, decision, cognitive control. When I said that if a person cannot turn it off, the default mode network could be reinforced, because that's when you go into non-task. As a comparison, when a person cannot turn it on, they can't get their ass in gear, as we sometimes say, then the cognitive control network could be a good choice. The cognitive control network is very much involved in a lot of contemporary new interests in meditation techniques, especially mindfulness. The cognitive control network goes into activity, goes into a dominance whenever you enlist the observer, the observer aspect in cognition, where you become aware of an experience. Instead of being immersed in the experience, you begin to observe the experience. I say in the beginning, you may not be able to be a neutral observer, but you could at least be a curious observer, because the curious observer still owns the experience to a good degree, where the neutral observer is able to have some distancing. Now here's a very interesting kind of dance, and it'll become even more interesting when we talk about the limbic system. But you could imagine that the default mode network and the cognitive control network play a game of musical chairs with one chair, so that when one is dominant, the other is subordinate, is submissive. So you can't have the default mode network and the cognitive control network acting equally at the same time. One pronounces as the other is then subdued. So you can you go back and forth between those two. You could say default mode network for a person that can't turn it off, and cognitive control network for the person that can't turn it on. Cognitive control, the observer. And now I'll introduce number 3, the limbic control. I had said I call them the big 3. I don't know, it just seems like that to me. Then I've not read that anywhere, so if it's a dumb idea, then forget about it. But until I understand it better, or you do, we can use that as a reference. So default mode, cognitive control, and limbic I call the big 3. The limbic is extraordinary. The limbic network is involved with the inflow of stimulation, the inflow of sensation, the inflow of information, as it comes into the central nervous system and makes its way up into the higher aspects of the central nervous system. And it's a kind of, like immigration, customs, if you get my idea, station in the flow. Because organisms, us, animals, beings, are always alerted to survival. So that when information comes in at a very deep level, usually it's called neuroception, which means it's a level of perception that is below conscious awareness. It's neuroception. We're always sensing and evaluating, is this experience, is this situation, is this threat or no threat? Is it dangerous? Is it safe? And what this does, as the flow comes up and becomes information, it starts off as stimulation, becoming information, the limbic system sets a feeling tone And this feeling tone is kind of halfway between raw sensation and emotion. So you've got sensation, feeling, emotion, and then thought. It's not exactly linear like that, but it's pretty close in most cases. So what happens is, and it's sometimes expressed, that we are feeling creatures that think and not thinking creatures that feel. So that the feeling state comes up, and as a feeling state, then it's related to past experiences and generating emotions, and then we assign thoughts to make a story about the experience. It's happening all the time. It's not instant, but almost instantaneous. So the limbic system has an awful lot to do with the translation of sensation to feeling to emotion to thought. And the thought, of course, happens in the higher cortex regions, not the limbic system. But the limbic system supplies a lot of the mood, if you could say, the mood of it, the sense of okay or not okay. And, there'll be explorations at a later point in what's called the limbic trauma loop, where the limbic system lies to you based on unresolved trauma. It gets really biased, it gets really afraid, it becomes timid, and will over-report threats even when they don't exist. So that's a big subject. And we'll stay away from that right now. Also, in the same way that the cognitive control and the default kind of do a musical chairs, so does the limbic system and the cognitive control. One of the bases of many techniques is now better understood in terms of neuroscience. These are meditation techniques, but they're also psycho-emotional neuroplastic techniques, that when you have a feeling state, especially as it starts to blend into emotion, and you could think of emotion as a call to action. Emotions are more elaborated, they're more matured in terms of past experience than just a raw feeling. A raw feeling is threat, no threat, and the emotion starts to color it, sad, mad, glad, and so on. The emotions are calls to action. They're supposed to provoke action of some sort. As this process is happening, what's understood now is if you recognize that translation from feeling to emotion, and you just label it, fear. As soon as you label it, as soon as you give it a name, you're engaging the cognitive control network, which then begins to subdue the limbic network. So the charge, the intensity, the feeling state, that action-reaction state of the emotion is reduced because the limbic network softens as the cognitive control starts to go into motion. So what you can see is that if you're working with a person relative to sensation, feeling, emotion, in that world, reinforcing a healthy functioning limbic network is going to be a great advantage. So these are the big three. And if you're working in brain exercise, if you're working at that foundation level, the core level, the root level, you know that being in the brain gym, you've got the single exercises that you can isolate, but you also have the opportunity of working with these teams or these networks, and you're going to be finding a lot of use in default, cognitive, and limbic, no doubt about it. Okay, so that's the first 3 of 7. I'll pause right now and we'll come back for the next 2, what I call the tango partners.